am thankful to be here with all of you tonight.
We have confirmation the column is stalled at the Oder, sir. We must authorize the counterattack immediately.
On the night of April 15, 1945, Georgy Zhukov stood before the most powerful artillery concentration in the history of warfare. Behind him, stretched across a front of 44 kilometers along the Oder River, were more than 8,000 guns and mortars, 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and over 1 million Soviet soldiers. Ahead of him was the Seelow Heights, the last significant defensive barrier between the Red Army and Berlin, held by German Army Group Vistula under the command of Colonel General Gotthard Heinrichsai, who had spent the previous weeks preparing a defense in depth that he believed would stop even most powerful Soviet assault. At 5 a.m. on April 16th, Zhukov gave the order to fire. What followed was the largest single artillery barrage in the history of organized warfare. 8,000 guns fired simultaneously. The sound was heard in Berlin, 60 kilometers away. The ground shook. The sky turned red. The Seelow Heights disappeared behind a wall of fire and smoke and dust that no defender who survived it would ever forget or fully describe. Then Zhukov turned on the searchlights. 143 searchlights, designed to blind the German defenders and silhouette their positions, were switched on across the full length of the front. The light they produced was not what Zhukov had planned for. The dust and smoke of the barrage, the enormous cloud of pulverized earth and destroyed vegetation that the thousands of shells had thrown into the air, reflected the searchlight beams back toward the Soviet lines. The German defenders, in their carefully prepared positions on the high ground above the Oder floodplain, could see nothing clearly through the light and the smoke. But the Soviet assault troops advancing across the flat ground below could see even less. They were advancing into a wall of reflected light, blinded by the searchlights that were supposed to be blinding the enemy. The assault on the Seelow Heights became, within hours of its beginning, one of the costliest single military operations of the European war. The Germans had not been destroyed by the barrage. Heinrichsai had anticipated the Soviet timing and pulled his forward units back from the first line of defense before the shells fell, leaving the Soviet artillery to pound empty positions while his men waited in their second and third lines of defense. The searchlights that were supposed to blind them instead blinded the attackers. The Soviet infantry that advanced across the floodplain in the pre-dawn darkness were moving through a nightmare of light and smoke, and artillery fired toward positions that were more intact than Zhukov's plan had assumed. The Seelow Heights cost the Soviet Union between 30,000 and 80,000 men killed in 4 days of fighting. The German estimate is at the lower end of this range. Soviet records, when they have been made available, suggest the higher end. The precise number cannot be established from the available evidence. What can be established is that the assault on the Seelow Heights was one of the bloodiest single engagements of the European War, and that the specific decisions made in the planning and execution of the assault contributed significantly to the cost. This is the story of those decisions and the man who made them, Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov. For times hero of the Soviet Union, Deputy Supreme Commander of the Soviet Armed Forces, the general who had saved Moscow in 1941 and Stalingrad in 1942, and who had driven the Wehrmacht back from the Volga to the Oder in 3 years of some of the most brutal warfare in human history. He was the greatest Soviet military commander of the war, and the Battle of the Seelow Heights was one of the most costly mistakes of his career. Before I go further, I want to ask something directly. If you've been watching this series and you haven't subscribed yet, do it right now. The next episode is about General Slim, the British commander who destroyed Japan's army in Burma in the most decisive land victory of the Pacific War, and who is almost completely unknown outside the military history community. That story is extraordinary, and most people have never heard it. Subscribe and activate the bell so it reaches you when it drops. And if this story about Zhukov moves you, if the cost of what happened at the Seelow Heights lands on you the way it should, hit the like button. It matters. Back to Zhukov. Back to April 1945 and the race for Berlin, the broader context of the Soviet war effort. The The specific scale and the specific character of what the Red Army had accomplished in 4 years of war against the Wehrmacht is essential to understanding the Seelow Heights in its proper historical frame. The Eastern Front was a decisive theater of the Second World War in Europe. This is not a controversial historical claim. It is a conclusion that the operational record supports so clearly that the only debate is about degree rather than direction. The Wehrmacht suffered approximately 80% of its total military casualties on the Eastern Front. The vast majority of German divisions were committed in the East throughout the war. The battles that determined the outcome of the European conflict, Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk, Bagration, were fought in the Soviet Union by Soviet soldiers at a cost in Soviet lives that no other nation was asked to bear. The Western Allied contribution to the European victory was real and significant. The strategic bombing campaign, the North Africa and Italy campaigns, the D-Day landing and the subsequent campaign through France and Germany all contributed to Germany's defeat. But the Western Allied contribution was secondary to the Soviet contribution in terms of the direct military force applied against the German army. The German military machine was broken on the Eastern Front by Soviet soldiers under Soviet commanders at a cost that the Western Allies' contribution cannot adequately measure. Zhukov was a central figure of this effort, not the only figure. Konev and Rokossovsky and Vasilevsky and others made essential contributions, but the most consistently significant. He had been at the critical point at the critical moment more often than any other Soviet commander. Moscow in December 1941, Stalingrad in November 1942, Kursk in July 1943, the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945, and finally Berlin in April 1945. His record across these operations, taken as a whole, represents one of the greatest sustained achievements in military command in the history of modern warfare. The Seelow Heights does not erase this record. It is part of the record, a specific operation in which the specific decisions made under specific pressure produce casualties beyond what the military necessity required. Military commanders across the history of warfare have made such decisions. The specific accounting of each operation, what was achieved, what it cost, what different decisions might have produced, is the work of military history, and the accounting of the Seelow Heights is part of the accounting of Zhukov's career. The specific comparison that the military historians most often make when assessing the Seelow Heights is to the British and American campaigns of 1944 and 1945, to operations like Market Garden or the Hurtgen Forest Campaign, or the various frontal assaults on German defensive positions that produced casualties disproportionate to their tactical achievements. These comparisons are instructive because they establish that costly operational decisions were not unique to the Soviet military, and that the specific pressures that produced them were present in every major military force of the war. The pressures at the Seelow Heights were particularly acute: the political deadline, the competition with Konev's front, the specific failure of the initial tactical plan. But they were not qualitatively different from the pressures that produced costly Western Allied operations. What distinguished the Seelow Heights was the scale, the number of guns, the number of soldiers, the number of casualties, the specific enormity of the Soviet military machine applied to the specific problem of breaking through the last German defensive barrier before Berlin. The scale of the Soviet war effort made its operations, including its costly operations, more visible in purely numerical terms than anything the Western Allied forces had conducted. The specific soldiers who fought at the Seelow Heights, the Red Army men who advanced across the Oder floodplain in the pre-dawn darkness of April 16, 1945, came from across the Soviet Union. They were Russians and Ukrainians and Belarusians and Central Asians and men from dozens of other Soviet nationalities, assembled in the Red Army that Stalin's mobilization had created and that 4 years of brutal fighting had trained to a level of tactical and operational effectiveness that the 1941 Red Army could not have imagined. Many of them had been fighting since the early years of the war. Some had joined after Stalingrad or after the liberation of their home regions as the Red Army drove west. Some were young enough that the war had begun when they were still in school. They had been soldiers long enough to understand what they were advancing into at the Seelow Heights, long enough to know that the German defense was capable of lethal resistance even in the final weeks of a war that was already lost, long enough to understand that the searchlights that were blinding them the wrong way, long enough to understand that the tanks mixed in with the infantry were not the exploitation force that the plan had called for, but the sign of a battle going wrong. They advanced anyway. They climbed the heights. They cleared the German positions one by one, at a cost that was real and recorded in the regimental histories and the casualty lists that the Soviet military archives had begun to make available. They were doing what soldiers do, advancing in the direction their orders pointed, with the weapons they'd been given, toward the objective that the plan had designated. And they were dying at a rate that the plan had not anticipated, and that the specific decisions of the assault's opening hours had made worse than it needed to be. The German defenders of the Silo Heights. Hammersai's army group Vistula, the soldiers who had pulled back from the forward positions before the barrage, and who had then fought the Soviet assault from their prepared positions in the second and third lines of defense, were also soldiers at the end of a war they had lost, defending terrain that their political leadership had told them to hold at all costs because holding it might somehow change the outcome that every professional military mind in Germany understood was fixed. The specific futility of the German defense of the Silo Heights, the specific courage of men dying to delay a result that was already determined, is part of the accounting of the final weeks of the European War. The war was over. The outcome was decided. The specific battles of April 1945 were producing casualties that the political and institutional dynamics of both sides required, but that the military situation did not. The Silo Heights was one of these battles, the product of Soviet political requirements and Soviet competitive dynamics on the one side, and German political requirements and German command culture on the other, combining to produce a battle whose specific military value was marginal compared to its specific human cost. This is not a novel observation. Military historians studying the final campaigns of major wars have consistently found that the closing battles tend to be disproportionately costly relative to their strategic value, precisely because the political and institutional dynamics of the final weeks generate pressure to achieve specific objectives at specific times regardless of the marginal strategic value of those objectives. The Silo Heights fits this pattern. Zhukov's response to the failure of the initial assault, his decision to commit the tank armies to the breakthrough battle rather than waiting for the breakthrough to be achieved, is a specific decision that the military critics focus on, and it is worth examining carefully because it illuminates the specific constraints within which he was operating. The commitment of the tank armies was, from a purely operational perspective, premature. The breakthrough had not been achieved when the tanks were ordered forward. The conventional wisdom of combined arms doctrine held that exploitation forces should not be committed until the breakthrough they are supposed to exploit is complete. Committing them early bogs them down in the breakthrough battle and destroys the operational mobility that makes them valuable for exploitation. Zhukov knew this. He had not achieved the breakthroughs at Stalingrad and Kursk and the Vistula-Oder offensive by committing exploitation forces before the breakthrough was complete. He had been patient, had waited for the conditions that his plans had specified, and had then unleashed the armor in the specific operational space that the breakthrough created. At the Silo Heights, he did not wait. The specific reason he did not wait was a deadline, the May Day deadline that Stalin had set, and that the initial failure of the assault was threatening. If the Heights were not taken in the first day or two, the advance to Berlin would fall behind schedule. The advance to Berlin falling behind schedule might mean that Konev's front, advancing from the south, would reach Berlin first. It might mean that the May Day deadline would be missed. Neither of these outcomes was acceptable to Zhukov in the political context in which he was operating, so he committed the tanks. The tanks were committed. The Heights were taken in 4 days at the cost that the evidence records. Berlin was reached. The May Day deadline was met with 2 days to spare. Stalin received his May Day victory. Zhukov received the honor of accepting the German surrender, and the soldiers who died at the Silo Heights received the graves that the Red Army's records, to the extent that those records are available, attempt to enumerate. The enumeration is incomplete. The Soviet military's record-keeping in the final weeks of the war was not adequate to the scale of the casualties being produced, and the specific number of men killed at the Silo Heights remains disputed by historians working from different sets of records and different methodological assumptions. The range between 30,000 and 80,000 killed is itself a measure of the inadequacy of the record. Somewhere in that range are the specific men who died in the pre-dawn darkness of April 16th and in the fighting of the 3 days that followed. They are the specific human content of the story. They are the reason the story matters, not the operational analysis, not the political pressure, not the competition between Zhukov and Konev, not the question of whether the deadline was necessary or the searchlights were a mistake. Those things matter for understanding what happened. The soldiers matter for understanding what it cost. Zhukov accepted the German surrender. Stalin received the victory. And somewhere between 30,000 and 80,000 Soviet soldiers were buried in the soil of Germany, 60 kilometers from the city that their deaths helped take. That is the Zhukov War. That is the Silo Heights. And that is the accounting that the men who died there deserve. The specific geography of the Silo Heights, the terrain that Heinrich defenders used and that Zhukov assault troops had to cross, is worth describing because it illuminates a specific military problem that the assault faced and why the decisions made in its planning and execution mattered so much. The Oder River, at the point where Zhukov's front crossed it, flows through a wide floodplain before reaching the Silo Heights. The floodplain is flat, open ground, agricultural land, interspersed with drainage ditches and irrigation canals, with no natural cover for attacking infantry. The heights themselves rise abruptly from the floodplain, a series of terraced ridges climbing 40 to 50 meters above the flat ground below. The roads that cross the heights are few and channeled through specific points that the defenders could cover with concentrated fire. This terrain was ideally suited to the defense that Heinrich had prepared. The defenders on the heights had clear fields of fire across the flat ground of the floodplain. The attacking Soviet infantry, advancing across that flat ground, had no cover and no concealment. The specific combination of the terrain and the German defensive preparation meant that the assault troops advancing in the pre-dawn darkness of April 16th were moving across open ground toward defenders who had not been destroyed by the barrage and who could engage them at distances of hundreds of meters with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. The searchlights that Zhukov had planned to illuminate the German positions and blind the defenders did not perform as intended in this terrain. The dust and smoke from the barrage, combined with the morning mist that lay in the floodplain, created a medium through which the searchlight beams scattered and reflected. The German defenders on the high ground were not blinded. They were looking down to the smoke and light at the Soviet assault troops who were illuminated against the flat ground below. The Soviet assault troops were looking up into a wall of reflected light that made it nearly impossible to see the positions they were advancing toward. This specific inversion of the intended effect, the searchlights illuminating the attackers rather than the defenders, is the detail that military analysts have focused on most intensively in assessing the Silo Heights, and it deserves the attention it has received because it illustrates the specific failure of the assault's tactical design. The searchlight concept was sound in theory. It had been used in various forms in other operations. The specific failure was in the application to the specific conditions of the Silo Heights terrain, the combination of the smoke from the barrage, the morning mist, and the geometry of attackers on a flat ground looking up at defenders on a high ground produced the exact opposite of the intended effect. Zhukov recognized this quickly. Within the first hours of the assault, the reports from the forward units made clear that the searchlights were not performing as planned. His response to this recognition is the second specific decision that the military analysts focus on. Rather than halting the assault to reorganize, rather than turning off the searchlights and waiting for dawn, rather than accepting a temporary setback and creating the conditions for a more effective assault, he ordered the tank armies forward into the developing chaos. The specific reasoning behind this decision, to the extent that it can be reconstructed from the available record, appears to have been the following. The assault was behind schedule, the searchlights had failed, but the objective was Berlin, and the deadline was May Day, and the only way to meet the deadline was to add the tank armies to breakthrough force and push harder. The military logic of waiting for better conditions was overridden by the political logic of the deadline. This is a specific moment in the Silo Heights story where the political pressure and the military decision intersect most clearly. The searchlight failure was a tactical failure that could have been managed. The assault could have continued after dawn, without the searchlights, in conditions that would have been more favorable to the attacking infantry. The commitment of the tank armies to the breakthrough battle before the breakthrough was an operational decision that the tactical situation arguably did not require. It was required, or Zhukov believed it was required, by the political situation, by the May Day deadline, and by the competition with Konev's front that was advancing from the south and that might reach Berlin first if Zhukov's front was delayed. The tank armies moved forward and entered the congestion that the stalled infantry assault had created. The roads through the heights were narrow and channeled, and the addition of hundreds of tanks to the mass of infantry already trying to advance through the same corridors created traffic jams that were attacked by German artillery and that further delayed the advance. The specific operational mobility of the tank armies, the quality that made them valuable as exploitation forces in open country, was negated by the terrain and congestion of the breakthrough battle. The 4 days that the assault of the Silo Heights required, from April 16th to April 19th, were among the most costly 4 days of the Soviet war effort. The German defenders fought with tenacity that reflected their understanding of what Soviet capture meant, and with a tactical skill that reflected Heinrich's preparation and the specific training of the troops he had positioned on the heights. The Soviet assault troops who ultimately cleared the heights did so at a cost that the May Day deadline had made unavoidable once the initial plan had failed. The fall of the Silo Heights on April 19th opened the road to Berlin. The advance that followed, the final 40 kilometers to the German capital, the Battle of Berlin itself, the urban fighting that continued until Hitler's suicide on April 30th and the German capitulation on May 2nd, was conducted with the same overwhelming Soviet material superiority that had characterized the entire Berlin operation. The German defenders of Berlin fought and died, and the city fell, and the war in Europe was over. Zhukov was at the center of the final scene. He signed the German instrument of surrender as the Soviet representative at the ceremony in Berlin-Karlshorst on May 8, 1945. He stood in the ruins of the city that his assault had helped take, and he accepted the surrender of the army that had invaded the Soviet Union nearly 4 years before. And he was the instrument of the Soviet Union's greatest military achievement and the expression of its greatest military sacrifice. He was 48 years old. He had been fighting for 4 years. He had saved Moscow and Stalingrad and driven the Wehrmacht from the Volga to the Oder and across the Oder to Berlin. He had made decisions that saved the Soviet Union, and decisions that costed more than the military necessity required. He had served a dictator who had executed his colleagues, who had constrained his operational freedom with political deadlines, who had awarded him the highest honors a Soviet state could give, and then stripped him of his command as a reward for victory. He was the greatest Soviet commander of the war. He was the instrument of a political system that used its commanders as tools of its political will, and discarded them when their usefulness or their prominence became inconvenient. He was a man of genuine military genius operating within a system that honored and punished genius in roughly equal measure. He died in 1974, honored and controversial. His memoirs have been published, shaped by the political constraints of the Soviet system and by his own defensive instincts about the most costly moments of his career. His reputation in Russia has grown in the decades since his death, as the scale of the Soviet war effort has become better understood, and as a specific contribution to it has been more clearly established. The Silo Heights is part of that contribution, not the part that the authorized narrative emphasizes, but the part that the honest accounting requires acknowledging alongside the victories at Moscow and Stalingrad and Kursk and the Vistula-Oder offensive. He gave the order. The men advanced. The heights fell. Berlin fell. The war ended. And somewhere between 30,000 and 80,000 Soviet soldiers were buried in the soil of the Silo Heights and the approaches to Berlin, the human content of the political deadline, and the tactical failures that the deadline had forced. They are counted here. They deserve to be counted here. The victory was real. The cost was real. The accounting requires both. That is the Zhukov War. The specific character of Georgy Zhukov, the man who ordered the assault on the Silo Heights and who accepted the cost it produced, is essential to understanding both why the assault was planned as it was and how the failures of the first hours were responded to. Zhukov had been shaped by the specific experience of the Red Army in the first years of the war, the catastrophic defeats of 1941, when the Wehrmacht had destroyed Soviet armies of millions of men in the opening months of Barbarossa, when the Soviet Union had come as close to total military defeat as any major power in the history of modern warfare. He had commanded during those defeats. He had watched the Red Army's officers being executed by Stalin for failures that were partly the product of the purges that had destroyed the officer corps in the late 1930s, partly the product of the doctrine that had left the Red Army unable to respond to the specific form of the German attack, and partly the product of leadership failures at every level of command. He had also been one of the officers who had survived, one of the commanders who had demonstrated in the crisis of 1941 and 1942 that the Red Army could learn, could adapt, could find officers capable of leading it effectively against an enemy of the Wehrmacht's quality. His defense of Moscow in December 1941, when he had committed the Siberian divisions that Stalin had released from the Far East and had launched a counteroffensive that stopped the German advance and drove it back from the Soviet capital, had been the turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The specific moment when the German assumption of Soviet military inferiority was proven wrong. The Zhukov who planned the Berlin operation in April 1945 was a man who had spent 4 years learning how to fight the Wehrmacht, learning through the specific costly experience of operations that had worked and operations that had failed, accumulating the specific institutional knowledge of large-scale Soviet offensive operations that no other army in the world had achieved. He understood combined arms warfare, the coordination of infantry, armor, artillery, and air power at a scale and with sophistication that the Soviet military had not possessed in 1941, and that no other military in the world had been required to develop in the same way. This specific expertise, the mastery of large-scale combined arms operations, was the basis of the confidence with which he planned the Berlin operation. He had conducted operations of comparable scale before. He had broken through German defensive positions that were defended with comparable skill and comparable fortitude. The specific formula of massive artillery preparation followed by armored exploitation had worked at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at the Vistula-Oder offensive in January 1945. It should work at the Silo Heights. The specific failure at the Silo Heights was not a failure of Zhukov's understanding of combined arms warfare. It was a failure of the specific intelligence picture about the German defensive preparations, combined with the tactical innovation, the searchlights, that failed in the specific conditions of the night of April 16th. Both of these failures were recoverable, in the sense that the Red Army had the material and human resources to absorb the initial setback and continue the assault. What was not recoverable, in the specific time frame that Stalin's deadline imposed, with the operational momentum that the premature commitment of the tank armies had destroyed. The relationship between Stalin's political deadline and Zhukov's operational decisions is the central tension of the Silo Heights story. The May Day deadline was not a military requirement. There was no operational reason why Berlin needed to fall by May 1st rather than by May 5th or May 10th. The deadline was political, imposed by Stalin's desire for symbolic and propaganda value of a Berlin victory on the Soviet national holiday. But the deadline was real in the sense that it shaped Zhukov's planning and his responses to the failures of the initial assault. A commander operating without a political deadline. A commander who could accept a slower, more methodical approach to the Silo Heights, who could wait for the initial assault to achieve its objectives before committing the exploitation forces, who could absorb the tactical failure and reorganize before pressing the attack, might have achieved the breakthrough at lower cost. Zhukov did not have that commander's freedom. He had a deadline. He committed everything. The cost was what it was. The specific relationship between political pressure and operational decision-making is one of the permanent tensions of modern warfare, and the Silo Heights is one of its clearest illustrations. Political leaders set objectives and timelines. Military commanders plan operations within those constraints. When the constraints are militarily reasonable, the operations tend to succeed at acceptable cost. When the constraints are militarily unreasonable, when the deadline is too tight, when the resources are insufficient, when the intelligence picture that shapes the plan is wrong, the operations tend to succeed at excessive cost or fail altogether. The Silo Heights succeeded, in the sense that the heights were taken and the advance to Berlin continued. The cost was excessive, in the sense that the specific tactical decisions of the first hours, the searchlights, the premature commitment of the tank armies, contributed to casualties that more effective execution of the plan would not have produced. The political objective was achieved on schedule. The military cost of achieving it on schedule was real and significant. This pattern, political deadline, military cost, achieved objective, was not unique to the Silo Heights. It was a recurring feature of the Soviet war effort, shaped by Stalin's specific approach to military command. Stalin set objectives. He set timelines. He accepted the cost of achieving those objectives on those timelines as the price of political control over the military campaign. The commanders who operated within this framework, Zhukov, Konyev, Rokossovsky, and the others who led the Red Army's final campaigns, were commanders who understood that their operational freedom was constrained by political requirements and who planned and executed accordingly. The specific cost of this approach, the excess casualties that political pressure imposed on military operations, is part of the accounting of the Soviet war effort that the heroic narrative of the Great Patriotic War tends to minimize. The Soviet Union won the war against Germany at a cost in human life that dwarfed the losses of every other Allied nation. The excess cost, the specific casualties that were produced not by the military necessity of defeating Germany, but by the political requirements of the Soviet regime, is a smaller but still significant component of that total. The 27 million Soviet citizens who died in the war, soldiers and civilians combined, represent the most catastrophic loss of life suffered by any nation in the conflict. Understanding that loss requires understanding both its military causes, the specific brutality of the Wehrmacht's campaign in the Soviet Union, the specific military problems of fighting an enemy of the Wehrmacht quality with the Red Army's initial deficiencies, and its political causes, the specific decisions of the Soviet regime, including Stalin's willingness to accept military losses that political control and political timing imposed. Zhukov was the instrument of the system. He was also, within its constraints, one of the most effective military commanders in the history of warfare. The two things are not contradictory. They are both part of the truth of who Zhukov was and what the Silo Heights represent. The specific soldiers who died at the Silo Heights, the tens of thousands of Red Army men who were killed in 4 days of assault on a defensive position that a better executed plan might have taken at lower cost, were the human content of the political and operational story. They were soldiers who had fought their way across the Soviet Union and Poland and into Germany, who had survived Stalingrad and Kursk and the Vistula-Oder offensive, who had earned their place in the front line of the final assault on the Reich. They died because the searchlights reflected the wrong way, because Heinrichsheim pulled his men back before barrage fell, because the tank armies were committed too early to a breakthrough that was not yet achieved. They died 60 kilometers from Berlin, in the last weeks of a war that had already been won in every strategic sense. They died because a political deadline required the assault to succeed in 4 days rather than 8, and because the specific operational choices made in response to the failure of the first hours added to the cost of achieving what the political deadline demanded. That is the specific moral weight of the Silo Heights. Not the general moral weight of wartime casualties, which is real and enormous, but the specific moral weight of casualties that were increased by specific decisions made under specific political pressure. The soldiers who died were not simply casualties of the war. They were casualties of the way the final campaign was conducted, of the deadline and the searchlights, and the premature commitment of the tank armies. They deserve to be counted. They are counted here. The race for Berlin is the essential context for understanding why Zhukov attacked the Silo Heights the way he did, and why the specific decisions he made cost so many lives. By April 1945, the war in Europe was clearly over. Germany was being squeezed from both sides. The Western Allies had crossed the Rhine in March and were advancing rapidly through central Germany, while the Red Army was massed on the Oder and Neisse rivers, less than 60 kilometers from Berlin. The question was not whether Germany would be defeated, but who would take Berlin, and what the political consequences of that specific outcome would be for the post-war settlement. Stalin wanted Berlin, and he wanted it taken by Soviet forces before the Western Allies could reach it. The political stakes of who took Berlin were enormous in his calculation. Berlin was the capital of the Reich, the center of what Hitler's regime had called a 1,000-year empire, the specific place where the Soviet victory would be most visibly and most permanently established. Taking Berlin would also give the Soviet Union leverage in the post-war settlement. The leverage of having borne the greatest burden of the European war and having achieved its most symbolically significant objective. The competition for Berlin was not simply between the Soviet Union and Germany. It was between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies. Eisenhower had decided, in March 1945, not to drive for Berlin, a decision that Churchill strongly opposed and that historical scholarship continues to debate. But even with Eisenhower's decision not to make Berlin a primary Allied objective, the speed of the Western advance through Germany created a constant pressure on Stalin and on Zhukov. The Western forces were moving fast. The Red Army needed to move faster, and the specific military problem of taking Berlin needed to be solved in a time frame that the political situation demanded. Stalin's specific demand, That Berlin be taken by May 1st, 1945, the Soviet May Day holiday, for propaganda and political value of that specific date, was a constraint within which Zhukov was planning the Berlin operation. May 1st was the deadline. Whatever it cost to meet that deadline was a cost that Stalin had implicitly accepted in setting it. The competition between Zhukov's First Belarusian Front and Konyev's First Ukrainian Front, the two Soviet army groups that were racing toward Berlin from different directions, was another element of the pressure that shaped the Silo Heights assault. Stalin had arranged the competition deliberately, refusing to specify at the planning conference which of the two fronts would take Berlin, instead drawing a line on the map that both fronts could cross if they reached it first. This arrangement guaranteed maximum Soviet effort and maximum Soviet speed, because neither Zhukov nor Konya could be certain of being commander who took Berlin, the most coveted military honor of the entire war, unless his front moved faster than the other. Zhukov was confident. He had reason to be. His operational record since the defense of Moscow in 1941 was arguably the greatest of any commander on any side in the European war. He had commanded at Stalingrad, at Kursk, at the relief of Leningrad, at the bag ration operation that had destroyed Army Group Center in the summer of 1944. He understood large-scale offensive warfare in a way that few commanders in history had understood it. His plan for the Berlin operation reflected this understanding. A massive, coordinated assault that would use the Red Army's overwhelming material superiority to break through the German defenses and reach Berlin before Konya's front or the Western Allies. The specific flaw in the plan, the flaw that produced the disaster of the Silo Heights, was the assumption about German defensive preparations. Zhukov's intelligence had identified the first line of the German defense. It had not fully appreciated the depth of the defense that Heinrichsheim had prepared, or the specific tactic that Heinrichsheim had used, the withdrawal of his forward units before the Soviet barrage. That would leave the barrage largely ineffective. Heinrichsheim was one of the most capable defensive specialists in the Wehrmacht. He had learned the techniques of elastic defense in depth, withdrawal before overwhelming fire, counterattack at the moment of the attacker's maximum disorganization on the Eastern Front, where 4 years of fighting the Red Army had provided an education in Soviet offensive tactics that no other theater could match. He knew how Zhukov attacked. He had prepared a defense designed to absorb the initial blow and make the subsequent advance as costly as possible. Zhukov's confidence in his plan, the confident of a commander who had executed operational plans of enormous complexity successfully throughout the war, may have led him to underestimate the specific tactical problem that Heinrichsheim's defense presented. The artillery barrage that was the centerpiece of the plan was designed to destroy the German defenders in the first line, allowing the Soviet assault troops to advance through the rubble of the German positions and into the space beyond. When Heinrichsheim pulled his men back, the barrage destroyed positions rather than defenders, and the Soviet assault troops advanced not into a shattered defense but into an intact one. The searchlights, the specific tactical innovation that Zhukov had added to the plan to blind the German defenders and illuminate the assault, made the disaster worse. The idea was sound in concept. Searchlights angled to catch the German defenders in their beams while leaving the Soviet attackers in relative darkness. But the execution failed in the specific conditions of the night of April 16th, with the dust and smoke of the barrage creating a medium to which the searchlight beams scattered and reflected back toward the Soviet lines. Zhukov recognized the problem within hours of the assault beginning. His response: to commit the tank armies that he had planned to use for exploitation, throwing them into the breakthrough battle before the breakthrough had been achieved, was a decision that military critics have focused on as a specific error that compounded the initial failure. Committing exploitation forces to the breakthrough battle destroyed their operational mobility and committed them to the grinding attrition of frontal assault that they were not designed for. The tanks that were supposed to drive through a broken German defense into the open country beyond Berlin found themselves in the middle of a traffic jam on the Silo Heights, mixed with the infantry that was fighting to the German positions, their speed and their operational freedom, negated by the congestion and by the German defensive fire that was more intact than the plan had assumed. The assault continued for 4 days. The Silo Heights fell on April 19th. The Red Army advanced toward Berlin. The cost had been enormous. The specific casualties of the 4-day battle, the specific damage to the operational mobility of the forces that had been committed to the breakthrough, the specific delay that the defense had imposed on the Soviet advance. Whether different tactical choices on the night of April 16th would have produced a significantly different outcome is a question that the military historians have debated without reaching consensus. What the historians have established is that Zhukov's response to the failure of the initial assault, doubling down, committing everything, accepting the casualties of a frontal battle that his plan had not anticipated, was consistent with the command style that had characterized his operations throughout the war. He did not have a plan B. He had more of plan A. In previous operations, where the initial plan had been adequate to the situation and the follow-on exploitation had been the decisive act, this approach had worked brilliantly at the Silo Heights, where the initial plan had failed to achieve its objectives and the follow-on exploitation forces had been committed to the breakthrough battle prematurely. It worked at an enormous cost. The fall of Berlin in the last weeks of April 1945 was one of the most brutal episodes of a European war. The fighting in the streets of the German capital, house to house, floor to floor, in the subway tunnels and the rubble of the bombed buildings, was a specific form of urban warfare that killed with a density that even the mass artillery of the preliminary bombardment had not achieved. The defenders of Berlin, a mix of SS units, Wehrmacht regulars, Volkssturm militia, and Hitler Youth in the closing days of the battle, fought with the specific desperation of people who understood that surrender to the Red Army carried consequences that were qualitatively different from surrender to the Western Allies. The consequences of Soviet capture were real, and they were shaped by 4 years of brutal German conduct on the Eastern Front. The Wehrmacht's campaign in the Soviet Union had been a campaign of extermination as well as conquest. The specific German treatment of Soviet prisoners, Soviet civilians, and the Jewish populations of occupied Soviet territory had created a hatred and a desire for revenge that the Soviet soldiers advancing into Germany in 1945 carried with them as an operational fact of the campaign. The mass rapes, the looting, the killings of German civilians that marked the Soviet advance into Germany were not simply the inevitable consequence of war. They were the specific consequence of what Germany had done in the Soviet Union, returned with interest to the German civilian population. Zhukov was aware of this. He issued orders against the excesses. The orders were ignored in ways that orders in armies sometimes are when the men carrying them have sufficient motivation, and the command structure is sufficiently distracted by the fighting to maintain the enforcement. The specific moral situation of the final weeks of the war on the Eastern Front is one that the triumphalist narrative of the Soviet victory tends to underemphasize, and that the honest accounting of what the war was requires acknowledging. Hitler died in his bunker on April 30th, 1945. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Zhukov accepted the German surrender in Berlin as a representative of the Soviet Union, the specific honor that Stalin awarded to the general who had reached Berlin and had been the instrument of Germany's defeat on the Eastern Front. The specific cause of the final campaign, the casualties of the Silo Heights, the deaths in the streets of Berlin, the Soviet losses in the final weeks of a war that was already won, is part of the accounting of what the race for Berlin meant and what it cost. Stalin's deadline produced the pressure that produced the assault. The assault produced the casualties. The casualties produced a victory that Stalin had demanded by May Day. He got his May Day victory. Berlin fell on May 2nd, 3 days ahead of the deadline. The cost was what it was, and the men who paid it were the men of the Red Army, the soldiers whose lives were the instrument of the political objective that Stalin had set and that Zhukov had been ordered to achieve. Zhukov's post-war career was, characteristically for the senior commanders of the Soviet state, a story of political persecution followed by partial rehabilitation. Stalin, who feared the popularity of the man who had won the war, stripped Zhukov of his command in 1946 and sent him to the military backwater of the Odessa military district, then to the Ural military district, assignments that were political punishments designed to remove him from the centers of power. He survived these assignments, and after Stalin's death in 1953, he was gradually rehabilitated, serving as defense minister under Khrushchev until 1957, when Khrushchev in turn removed him from his position, apparently for accumulating too much personal power. He died in 1974 at 77 in Moscow. He is buried at the Kremlin Wall necropolis, alongside the other heroes of the Soviet state whose service the regime had honored and then periodically persecuted in the specific cycle of honor and punishment that characterized the relationship between Soviet military commanders and Soviet political leadership. His legacy in Russia is the legacy of a national hero, the commander who saved Moscow, the commander who won Stalingrad, the commander who took Berlin, the specific cost of his victories, the specific decisions that produced the Silo Heights casualties, the specific relationship between the political pressure of Stalin's deadline and the operational choices that cost so many lives, are part of the historical accounting that the heroic narrative tends to minimize. The accounting requires both the victory, which was real and decisive, and the cost, which was also real and which the men who paid it deserve to have acknowledged in the same breath as the victory they achieved. 80,000 soldiers, the Silo Heights, for days, one general's plan, one dictator's deadline, and the specific price of reaching Berlin before May Day. That is the Zhukov War. The specific post-war treatment of the Silo Heights in Soviet and Russian historical memory illustrates the broader pattern of how the Soviet Union, and subsequently Russia, has understood and presented a memory of the Great Patriotic War. Soviet historiography of the war was not simply falsified. It was shaped by the political requirements of the regime, by the specific version of the war's events that served those requirements, and by the systematic suppression of information that complicated or contradicted the authorized narrative. The authorized narrative of the Silo Heights emphasized the victory, the taking of the heights, the fall of Berlin, the achievement of the May Day objective, without the specific accounting of what the victory cost and how the specific decisions of the assault's opening hours had contributed to that cost. This shaping of the narrative was not unique to the Soviet case. Every nation that fought the Second World War shaped its memory of the war in ways that served its post-war political and cultural needs. The American memory emphasized individual heroism and just cause. The British memory emphasized national resilience and collective endurance. The German memory, which has gone through its own specific evolution, from denial to confrontation to a more complex acknowledgement, has had to work through the specific moral weight of what Germany did during the war in ways that no other national memory has faced. The Soviet and Russian memory of the war, the memory of the Great Patriotic War, as it has been called since the conflict itself, has centered on the scale of the sacrifice and the magnitude of the victory. The 27 million Soviet dead, the cities destroyed and rebuilt, the specific battles, Stalingrad, Kursk, Berlin, that marked the turning points of the Soviet war narrative. These are real. They deserve acknowledgement. They have been acknowledged in Russia with a consistency and an intensity that reflects how central the war experience is to Russian national identity. What the authorized narrative has been slower to acknowledge is the specific dimension of the Soviet war effort that the Silo Heights represents. The specific decisions made under specific political pressure that cost more lives than the military necessity required. The soldiers who died because the searchlights were turned on at the wrong time, because the tank armies were committed before the breakthrough was complete, because the May Day deadline required speed that military prudence would have counseled against. These soldiers are part of the same sacrifice that the authorized narrative commemorates. Their deaths are part of the 27 million. But the specific reason their deaths were necessary, the specific decisions that made their deaths part of that number rather than the natural consequence of fighting Germany, is a dimension of the story that the authorized narrative has been reluctant to examine. The archival opening that has occurred since the Soviet collapse has allowed historians, both Russian and Western, to begin the work of examining the specific operational records of the Silo Heights and the Berlin operation more carefully than was possible during the Soviet period. This work has produced a more complete picture of the specific decisions and the specific costs than the authorized narrative provided. It has not produced a comprehensive account. The Soviet military archives remain partially accessible, and the specific casualty records for the final weeks of the war are incomplete, but it has produced enough to establish the broad outline of what happened and why. Zhukov himself, in his memoirs published in the Soviet period, addressed the Silo Heights with a specific defensive posture of a commander who understood that the battle's course had been costly and who was working within the constraints of what he could acknowledge publicly. His account emphasized the difficulties of the terrain, the effectiveness of the German defense, and the ultimate success of the operation. The specific decisions, the searchlights, the premature commitment of the tank armies, were addressed in ways that distributed the responsibility more broadly than the operational record supports. This is not unusual. Commanders' memoirs generally address their most costly decisions in ways that explain and contextualize rather than simply acknowledge. Zhukov's memoirs were shaped by the additional constraint of being written in a political environment in which the specific criticism of Soviet military operations was itself politically charged, and in which the authorized narrative of the war's conduct was not something that a senior Soviet commander could easily challenge. The honest accounting of Zhukov's career, the accounting that the historical record supports, is neither the unreserved heroism of the authorized narrative nor the simple indictment of a commander who committed soldiers carelessly to unnecessary deaths. It is a more complex accounting of a commander of genuine greatness operating within a political system that imposed specific costs on military operations, and whose specific decisions at the Silo Heights reflected both his genuine military capability and the specific constraints of the system in which he commanded. He was the greatest Soviet commander of the war. He was also the commander who gave the order that sent tens of thousands of men into a battle whose opening hours went wrong in specific ways that his plan had not adequately accounted for. Both things are true. The accounting requires both. The specific legacy of the Silo Heights in the broader history of the Berlin operation is one that the military scholarship has continued to work on as the Soviet archives have become more accessible and as the operational record has been more fully reconstructed. The competing narratives. Zhukov's narrative of a difficult but ultimately successful operation conducted under extreme pressure. Konya's narrative that his southern advance was more effectively conducted and might have taken Berlin faster if the command arrangement had allowed it. And the critical narrative of historians who have focused on the specific tactical failures of the opening hours reflect the genuine complexity of an operation that was simultaneously one of the greatest military achievements of the war and one of its most costly. The honest accounting holds all of these narratives simultaneously. Zhukov achieved his objective. He took the Silo Heights. He took Berlin. He met the May Day deadline. He did all of this at a cost that the specific decisions of April 16th had increased beyond what military necessity alone required. The victory was real. The cost was real. The specific relationship between the political pressure and the military cost is a historical lesson that the Silo Heights most clearly teaches. Military commanders operate within political systems. The political systems set objectives and timelines. The commanders achieve those objectives within those timelines at whatever cost the intersection of the military situation and the political requirements produces. At the Silo Heights, that intersection produced a cost between 30,000 and 80,000 lives in 4 days. The political objective was achieved. The soldiers who died achieved it. The accounting of what they achieved and what it cost them is the accounting that history owes them. Zhukov gave the order. The men advanced. The heights fell. The war ended. That is the Zhukov War.